Hi everyone, welcome back to Novel Nomad and welcome to my Aussie April recommendations well, not TBR, but recommendations video. So I am going to be going through quite a large number of books that I'll be recommending for everyone to perhaps read and explore and, see if you can get a copy in your local library, or if your local bookstore stock some Aussie lit, it's always great to check it out. But like I said, it's going to be quite large. I've kind of put these into sections, as I know I have a lot of different genre readers here. So if you're interested in trying different genres, I'll try and do a breakdown and put it in the descriptor below so you can jump ahead to any of the specific genres that you're after. So starting out, of course, let's start with poetry. So with poetry today, I've got quite a number of very amazing poetry that I adore, and I love reading poetry. I think it's a really great short snippets into a very expressive landscape, and it really shows you emotional and social issues that are happening within Australia at the time. So obviously, number one, absolutely recommend anything by Maxine Beneba Clarke. She has released other poetry collections, and she does on her website, I think on her website or her Twitter or even Instagram, she does poetry for the Saturday paper, but this is her collection, Carrying the World, I should say, sorry, and it is absolutely phenomenal. She is Maxine Beneba Clarke is a Black Australian, and she basically goes back and looks at the history of Black people in England and sees where her family originated from and everything that they suffered because of that. So this is phenomenal, incredible, descriptive narrative poetry, and it is beautiful. So next on the list is going to be Ruby Moonlight by Ali Colby Eckermann, and this is an Indigenous poet, and this one is more of a narrative collection of poetry, like interconnected moments of this young woman who is basically surviving a colonial invasion into the mid-north South Australian area, and basically looking at her loss and loneliness and need for connection, and the loss of her space, family, and sense of home. And so this one, it was very, very emotional. It's beautiful. I highly recommend. Next we have Kindred. This is by Kirralie Saunders. This one is very vivacious, open, beautiful poetry, and the cover just matches it perfectly, so I recommend this one. Next we have Ellen Van Neven, Comfort Food. This is an interesting collection of poetry. Like, I've read her collection Throat, which was really amazing about the use of speech and words in Indigenous poetry, and this is more about the sense of home and food and centre and person. So it is really thoroughly excellent. Lastly, one I haven't read, so I might chuck this on my TBR pile, and that is Alison Whittaker's Black Work. This one, like I said, I haven't read, but I've heard wonderful things about it, and it's another collection of Indigenous Australian poetry that I highly recommend everyone check out as much as you can. Okay, so the next kind of genre is classic Australian literature. I'm not 100% sure. These ones I just feel like a classic story to me, mainly because they're written in the 1960s and 50s, I think, for one, and 60s for the other, and it's just some really interesting look at more of a historical Australian viewpoint. And the first one is Neville Shute on the Beach. This is a bit like a really fascinating look into the Cold War era environment and world, and the fear that was around nuclear power at the time, and how it's like almost a post-apocalyptic scene. So basically all the northern hemisphere has been completely destroyed in a nuclear apocalyptic war, and the nuclear mist is making its way down to the southern hemisphere. And so it's actually quite fun to see like the fear of this, the radioactive mist coming further and further down and covering the land. So they lose power, they lose connection from Sydney, and these are all people down in Melbourne. And the one's a submarine captain, so he goes out for voyages to see if there's anyone left alive in up north, but there's nothing. So it's just interesting to see that kind of fear playing out on the page. Next, something which is wonderfully romantic and is even in movie format. So if you feel like you even want to watch an Australian movie, I do recommend. The book is called The Women in Black and the movie is called The Ladies in Black. And it's about a young girl who just finishes her year 12. She's waiting to hear what her results to get into university were. This is set in the 1950s. And she's waiting, you know, on the edge of her seat to find out what's going on. But she decides that she might as well get a job in a local department store. I can't remember what it's called in the book, but it's basically inspired on David Jones, which is still a department store in Australia at the current time. And so it is just wonderful it follows the stories of the women she meets in this department store, and also how they change her view of herself and how she changes their view of how they view themselves and how they view their place in the world. And it's just really lovely. So it's these like 4 or 5 women and all their interconnecting stories, and it's just beautiful. Okay, so the next one is fiction. Now, Australia had a wonderful publishing year for fiction last year, so I'm going to kind of hold up 3 which all fall into the more mid-30s woman, young woman kind of navigating her place in the world. Fiction, if you're after that. I've only read Kokomo of these 3, but they have got very high recommendations. So you have Kokomo by Victoria Hannon, set in Melbourne, very, very good. A young woman living it up in London, living the life that she's always wanted, but then she gets a call from home in Melbourne to find out that her mother, who hasn't left the house since her father's death, well, since her husband's death I should say, has finally left the house. So she flies back to Melbourne and has to face her past that she left behind. Next we have Cherry Beach by Laura McPhee Brown. So it starts off with 2 women who basically have been best friends for most of their life, and they strike out, study at university together in Melbourne, and then they decide to go to Toronto on an exchange, and they both go very divergent paths, and it's kind of showing the faults and the lines within their friendships. And so this one has one of the most beautiful covers, I think, that came out of last year, but has also been hugely popular. Lastly, a more recent release by Kativa Bedford is Friends in Dark Shapes. This is set in Sydney, and the narrator of this piece, the main character, is actually nameless. Apparently it's very dreamlike and very internal, so it's almost as if you're viewing all of these different people in this Sydney like shared house, and you're seeing this life playing out before your eyes, and apparently it's brilliant. And once again, another very beautiful cover, and one that has been getting a lot of hype. So if you're after something more modern, some more contemporary Australian fiction, try any one of these. Once again, one I've just read recently, and I did post up a book review for, so do go check that one out. I'll link it down below. And that is Flames by Robbie Arnaud. This was amazing. It was after, you know, it's hints of magic realism in it, set in Tasmania. There's 2 siblings. Of these 2 siblings, the mothers die, and they go into grief in very different ways. So the sister runs away, and then the brother, he feels like, so his sister never has to go through that again, he starts to build her a coffin. And the only reason is because the women in that family line, they don't die once, they die twice. So it's a very eerie magic realism look at grief in Tasmania. Now, if you're wanting a little bit more historical fiction, one that's come out and is on the shortlist for the Stella Prize, and that is Stone Sky Gold Mountain by Miranda Riro. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. It was just a really fascinating look at Chinese migrants in the 1860s going into Queensland goldfields, and the relationships and the difficulties that they have there. It also follows another young woman who is from an Irish migrant family, and she basically was in disgrace almost, and she was working in the goldfields area as a penance almost for what she did, even though she was grieving in herself for what had happened to her. So I thoroughly enjoyed this one, and I liked that, you know, even though there was a lot of darkness and a lot of turmoil that they had to go through, there was a slight glimmer of hope that came out of this story. And lastly, something very different for anyone who wants to have a very different fiction experience, and that is Laura Jean McKay's The Animals in That Country. Once again, is a Stella Prize shortlist, and this is about a pandemic. So March 2020 was probably the most interesting time to publish a pandemic novel, but this is a pandemic novel that really, interestingly enough, the symptoms of having this virus is the fact that you can suddenly hear creatures around you, animals, bugs, anything like that, and people pick up on different frequencies to different animals, and people slowly go mad. So it is really fascinating to see how this one is a very dark, twisted look at our consciousness and the community consciousness, really, and how animals are slowly being pushed further and further away from what is deemed human idea, and then this is kind of bringing us back into the fold of the animal kingdom. Alright, so let's go into YA novels, so young adult novels, and I've got a few here. First off, Making Friends with Alice Dyson has just come by Poppy Newso. Local author, has just come out in the US, so I think I was recommending this one all last year. It is such a wonderful contemporary novel about two very awkward people finding themselves in high school, and they have to work together, and then they find out that they get along a lot better than either of them would have expected. That one is excellent good fun, and it's got a really gorgeous cover in the US. But what I will definitely absolutely recommend, two books. One is came out late last year, and that is None Shall Sleep by Ellie Marney. This is set in probably the late 80s, early 90s, and is a bit of a X-Files minus the aliens YA thriller, where these kids are called in to interview these two kids who have had very traumatic experiences. They are both out of high school, I think they're both in university, and they are called in to help FBI detectives interview teenage serial killers. So because the teenage serial killers aren't even listening to the adults, they have absolutely no time for them. So they decide to have some interviewers go in that are considered peers of the serial killers, and it's just so fascinating. So it's basically comes into play because there is another suspected teen serial killer on the loose, and so they have to interview these people to try and understand the motive for teens to do these things, and it's like edge of your seat kind of thriller. It's really fantastic. I highly recommend. The other YA novel is very recent, just came out in February, and that is The Boy from the Mish by Gary Lounsborough, and this is really wonderful. It is basically, as Gary said, he never felt he could see himself in books, and so he decided to write an Australian Indigenous Simon versus a Homo sapien agenda, and it is such a beautiful coming of age, coming out YA queer novel that I just want everyone to read, because they're very real. It's a very real experience about this Indigenous boy who's growing up in country, coastal New South Wales, and he has all the issues of school and education, decides what he wants to do, and there's some guys at school who are not that great and racist at the same time, and so you're having all of those issues that are compounding in. And then his aunt and cousins arrive for Christmas, and they bring with them a very mysterious young man called Thomas, who has just got out of juvenile detention and is with his aunt to actually learn a little bit more. So they discover and build a greater connection to country and connection with each other together. So it's really, really beautiful. So those people who love crime, I'm going to recommend the classic crime books, which is obviously Kerry Greenwood wrote the Franny Fisher series. I really thoroughly enjoy reading one every now and then. It's a perfect little cozy 1920s set in Melbourne. Highly recommend. Next you have the absolutely amazing Sulari Gentile series, which is a Roland Sinclair series, sorry, and that is set in Sydney during the 1930s, and the depth and historical accuracy in this books are stunning. Absolutely love it. Chef kiss, beautiful. So I think I'm up to book 4 or 5, but it is brilliant and I highly recommend. And of course, my last of my, Australian must-read series is Jane Harper. She's just released a new one called The Survivors, which I now believe is everywhere in the world. Well, in most places in the world. But I love The Lost Man. You could read The Dry. The movie's just come out of The Dry, which I believe was very good. I thoroughly enjoyed that movie. So yeah, this is another great, more contemporary Australian read that you could check out as well. Alright, so let's start on some romance. Now there's two that I just want to get here today, and the first one being The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. This is coming out as a movie. The book is absolutely hilarious. A contemporary, you know, Josh and Lucy work in the same office together, and they always have these little games and, like, you know, try to be the wittiest, the most sarcastic, you know, who can outsmart each other that day. But of course they're playing a larger game, which is of love. But it is a very sweet romance, and one that I highly recommend, and it is just so much fun. So I can't wait to see the movie. I think it's coming out like late this year or maybe very early next year, but one that I definitely recommend everyone pick up and read. The other romance I recommend is Upside Down by N.R. Walker. This is actually really good fun because it's an asexual or ace romance, which is incredibly rare, but it is absolutely beautiful, very sweet, and trust me, you want to be part of the soup crew after you read this. It is very, very lovely, and one I highly recommend. Let's get into some fantasy. Now there is a lot of brilliant Australian fantasy, so much so, like, you know, Sean Williams, Garth Nix, everything like that, Isabel Carmody. But let's start with absolutely, she's basically born in New Zealand and she is a New Zealander, but she now lives in Australia. And Kate Howell has just read The Daughter of the Forest, which is the first book in her series, and that is Juliette Marillier. A little bit of a love for Juliette Marillier on here. I highly recommend her work. Her writing is beautiful. She can write like historic, like medieval settings wonderfully. Daughter of the Forest is absolutely stunning. It's more like a Celtic retelling of the seven, I think it's the Seven Swans, but it is absolutely beautiful, that story, and it's so heart-wrenching. And it's actually a series, so you don't worry if you know you only get the one book. It's absolutely amazing. So these ones are part of her other series. This is the YA series that she did called Wildwood Dancing, which, as you can see, has a beautiful cover. That one is a little bit more of fae and magic realm. Then you've got Heart's Blood, which is a bit more like a medieval, like Beauty and the Beast retelling almost, but one that I highly recommend, and I was absolutely obsessed with this book, so I had to wait till the actual cover came out in Australia that I wanted. And this one is a really fascinating series, so it's a bit like a crime murder mystery fae series set in like a Celtic medieval period. And it's The Dreamer's Pool, Blackthorn and Grimm novel. So I highly recommend. This is really good fun. So if you do want to check out any Juliette Marillier, I'm pretty sure she's everywhere. So hopefully, and she's been writing for a while. So I am claiming her for part of Aussie April recommendations. Lastly, let's go through some non-fiction, because non-fiction in Australia is also absolutely amazing. So first off, if you just want something short and more nature-based, we have City of Trees by Sophie Cunningham. And it's basically a collection of essays on looking at life, death, and the need for nature within cityscapes, and the need for nature within people's lives to really have this greater connection to the world around you, and not just the developed human world that is. So this one is absolutely beautiful, and it's now thankfully in a smaller format, so it's not as pricey when you go to get it at the bookstore. Next, a more recent one I've just acquired, and that's Coming of Age in the War on Terror by Randa Abdel Fattah. And this is really fascinating because it's looking at the Islamophobia that came out after 9/11 and how that changed how the government views people, and it has more internal surveillance. And it's looking very much at Australia. Obviously this was a world issue, but it's looking very much at what happened in Australia. And so this is obviously also coming of age, all the people who basically were born in the very late 90s or early 2000s, and they even looked like what was being said a terrorist looked like, and how that affected them and their perceptions of being part of the community growing up. So I think it's really fascinating, and it's something that really needs to be looked at, because I mean that's nearly, this year is going to be 20 years on since the event. So it's interesting to see all those people who grew up with that experience as being their base note. So one that I am highly interested in, but I can't fit it on my TBR. I think I might have to read it in May. But next, one that's probably also going to follow in May is Witness by Louise Mulligan. She's an ABC investigative journalist, and she looks into the different injustices and the cost of seeking justice in the Australian legal system. And it is absolutely brilliant from all reports. One being Jacqueline from 6 Minutes for Me. She knows her stuff about the legal profession, so I definitely would take any recommendation she has for non-fiction. Next we have a local author, Kylie Marsden, Show Me Where It Hurts, and it's looking at people who live with invisible illnesses, she being one of them, and how basically where injury and illness is always meant to be physical or meant to be shown, and it's, you know, how that stigma is surrounding mental health is still there, and the stigma surrounding invisible illnesses, and how, you know, how people can better address it within society. So this is one that sounds absolutely fascinating, and supporting local writers as well, so can't wait to read this one either. Lastly, another one I've just picked up, but I've been wanting to read for a very long time because I do love reading feminist texts, but this one is called Talking Up to the White Woman, and this is feminism within Indigenous Australian communities, and it's looking at how feminism really hasn't been focusing on what it can do for Indigenous people, people of colour, black people, because it's always been driven by white people, and it's been done to, you know, profit white people as well. So I think this is really interesting, kind of taking what feminism means for Indigenous people and how, you know, their voice can be included in the conversation, which is so essential, because why have a conversation if you're only having half the people at the table? So these are some of the books I've recommended, and if you are interested in reading any of these books, let me know down below. I'd love to discuss them further. But I hope you have a wonderful Aussie April. Good luck reading, and see you next time. Bye.